And now we turn to the distinguished lecture for 2011. This year's lecturer is Richard Borshay Lee. He is University Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at the University of Toronto, where he received his BA and MA degrees before earning his PhD at the University of Berkeley, or University of California, Berkeley. Professor Lee's research interests range from human rights and indigenous peoples to ecology and history, AIDS, the politics of culture, and the anthropology of state societies. Recently, along with his wife, Professor Harriet Rosenberg of York University, he is focused on the critical issues of human health posed by the pharmaceutical industry. He is intellectually best known for his studies of hunting and gathering societies, particularly the Zutwazi. Not doing the clicks, but he gave me permission not to do that. Of Botswana and Namibia. And since the 1960s, Professor Lee has made 20 field trips to the Kalahari Desert, most recently in the summer of 2010. His work has been heralded as stimulating a paradigm shift in our thinking about deep human history. Professor Lee has noted, for example, that for 90% of our history as humans, we have lived as hunter-gatherers. His research findings that sharing and cooperation and not aggression have been the key to our success as a species have influenced philosophers, political scientists, psychologists, and biologists, and led to formulating new theories about human nature and the evolution of human behavior. Professor Lee's 1979 book, The Kongsong, Men, Women, and Work in a Foraging Society, received the Herskovits Award of the African Studies Association, the Anisfield Wolf Award in Racial Relations by the Cleveland Foundation, and was named one of the 100 most important works in science of the 20th century by the journal American Scientist. As past president of the Canadian Anthropological Society, Professor Lee has also been elected to fellowship in the Royal Society of Canada and a foreign member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Earlier this year, he was elected to the National Academy of Sciences of the United States, one of only 20 Canadian scientists in that body and the only anthropologist. And not last and not least, I should say that my students, hundreds of them over the last years, have read his work, including Christmas in the Kalahari, and been encouraged that undergraduates aren't the only people that ever make mistakes in cultural interpretation. And so I give you Richard Lee.
I don't know why we, oh look, it fell out.
That would be why. So.
In spite of our...
There will be a brief pause while the technical stuff gets going. Okay, good. Thank you very much, Professor Furlow. This is a treat. I just learned that Christopher Furlow's dad invited me to give a talk at Broward Community College in the 1970s. So we have a two generations of anthropologists here. I'm honored to be invited to be the speaker at this year's GAD ceremony, and it gave me an opportunity to reflect on life with the Jeune Kwasi. When I started out studying the Jeune Kwasi, a small hunter-gatherer group in northern Botswana in 1963, I had no idea that 48 years later I would still be working with the same group, or that the group would have generated a small industry of anthropologists across 5 decades and across a wide range of subdisciplines, from genetics to ethnoarchaeology to child-rearing practices to folklore and mythology. And that the lives of the field workers would be so intertwined with the lives of the Jeune Kwasi. I was invited by the GAD to reflect on my years with the Jeune Kwasi and the lessons that I've learned. But before I do so, I want to address the question, what pre-adapted me for a lifetime of anthropology that focused on these remarkable people. I see three recurring themes: my Canadian Jewishness, my family's progressive politics, and my love of nature. I was born to a family of Russian-American Jews and raised from the age of 4 in Toronto, Canada. My sense of my Jewishness was threefold. First, the central importance of family and family feuds in social life. Second, my love of the importance of food and social eating. And third, the role of laughter and humor in maintaining sanity in a crazy world. This jived perfectly with my reading of Junquois core values. Kinship was central to the conduct of social life. As foragers, food was a constant preoccupation, and their capacity for laughter, especially in the face of adversity, was a key survival adaptation. And quarrels, as you will see, are the very stuff of daily interaction. My dear wife, Harriet Rosenberg, later was to capture the essence of this in her much-cited paper titled Complaint Discourse, Aging and Caregiving Among the Kung San of Botswana. The backstage title of this paper had been Kvetches of the Kalahari. So there was definitely a resonance between the Junquois culture and my Jewishness. And what about my family's progressive values? Like many Jewish families of the 30s, 40s, and 50s, mine was heavily involved in left-wing politics. My father had worked for the Seafarers Union. I went on my first protest march in my stroller at age 2. One of the earliest memories, my earliest memories, is of the legendary artist and political activist Paul Robeson performing at my parents' organization of secular progressive Jews, the UJPO, the United Jewish People's Order. From an early age, children in our family were raised and encouraged to fight for social justice. Why then, you might ask, did I go to the Kalahari Desert for much of the 1960s when I could have been back in the thick of the civil rights and anti-war movement in North America? Well, the Kalahari and their peoples were not as distant from the issues of social justice as you might think. The Junquois, for example, then known as the Kung Bushmen, were famous in the anthropological literature for their egalitarian, non-hierarchical political values. They lived lightly on the land, so they represented an early example of living well, meeting their needs, and ecological sustainability, captured in Marshall Solon's phrase, the original affluent society. An even more pressing link with the anti-war struggles of the 1960s was the fact that the Junquois straddled the border between independent black Africa and white-controlled apartheid territory. My camp at Dobi, Botswana was less than 2 miles from the border of the white-ruled colony of Southwest Africa, now Namibia, putting the Jew on the front lines of the anti-apartheid struggle. So there was a good fit between the values I was raised to cherish and their counterparts among the hunting and gathering Jew of the distant Kalahari. The third element in my personal makeup that drew me to undertake fieldwork with hunter-gatherers was my love of my adopted country, Canada, and its natural riches. From the age of 8, I was shipped off to summer camp north of Toronto. My first time canoeing and camping out under the stars instilled in me a love of the outdoors. The Canadian North was a world of water, with canoes the main form of transport. Canoe tripping became my passion, and I still remember the 11-day canoe trip I took as an 18-year-old on Lake Temagami, 500 kilometers north of Toronto. My undergraduate education at the University of Toronto was focused on Canada's north. with teachers like Robert C. Daly, who worked with the Inuit of Rankin Inlet, and R.W. Dunning, a Cambridge-trained social anthropologist known for his work with the northern Ojibwe. My first ethnographic fieldwork was on the north shore of Lake Superior among the Ojibwa, and I assumed that doctoral work would somehow take me back to the north. When I came to the UC Berkeley campus in 1961 to do my doctorate with Sherwood L. Washburn, fate steered me in a radically different direction. The distinguished Africanist archaeologist J. Desmond Clark had arrived to take up a position at Berkeley, and he came with a shopping list of projects he wanted students to do. One was an ethnographic study of subsistence among the considerable population of the Bechuanaland Protectorate, now Botswana, of Kalahari Bushmen who still maintained a hunting and gathering way of life. I eagerly jumped at the opportunity. Next to the Canadian North, Africa was on my short list of places to do research. My mentors at Berkeley, in addition to Washburn and Clark, included Robert Murphy, from whom I learned cultural anthropology in the Boasian tradition, and Robert Heiser, who taught about California's rich database on hunter-gatherers in the Kroeber School of Anthropology. Also central to my formation as an anthropologist was my collaboration with Irvin DeVore. Starting out as a primatologist and briefly a professor at Berkeley, he soon moved to Harvard, and for the bulk of his career, and I later followed him. Parenthetically, if you review this list of mentors and their disciplines, it's pretty clear why I was destined to be a proponent of general anthropology. But was I, a child of northern forests, cut out to spend a year of my life in the heat and aridity of the African desert? I resolved to find out if I had the right stuff to be a desert anthropologist. In August of 1962, I drove to Death Valley, California. The temperature at the Furnace Creek Ranger Station was 116 degrees Fahrenheit, and the park was deserted. I found the extreme temperature strangely invigorating. I found I could function in the heat, and it brought out in me a certain euphoria, a kind of climate-induced spirituality. Look at me, I said, a small Jewish boy from the suburbs of Toronto, toughing it out and finding inner peace in the hottest and most desolate spot in all of North America. So, in August of 1963, I found myself in a Land Rover, purchased on an NSF grant to Washburn and DeVore, and on my way to northwestern Botswana. I was headed to a remote border zone some 40 miles east of Gausha, where the famous Lawrence and Lorna Marshall expeditions had focused in the 1950s. My first encounters with the Zhu in October 1963 are well recorded in the opening pages of my book, The Dobie Junkwasi. I traveled to the waterhole of Dobie and waited to see who would come to greet me. Among the first people encountered was a woman named Bao, married to one Bao. Bao was a handsome woman in her 20s with a growing family. Remember her name, we will encounter her again. Bao's father-in-law was a crusty old man named Puma Gui, Puma Sour Plum, and the name fit perfectly. He was a constant source of salty commentary on the world, which he viewed with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. I carried in my knapsack copies of all Lorna Marshall's papers, including her classic Talking, Sharing, and Giving, which documented the Zhu's core value of sharing. So I wasn't exactly prepared when old Puma took me aside on my arrival day and through an interpreter described how the gifts of blankets, pots, and clothing given by the Marshall expeditions had bypassed them completely. He then said, quote, "Now that you have come, we are glad. Now we have a white man of our own. We expect good things from you, so don't disappoint us. If you have anything to give away, give everything to us, not to those other people." And he gestured broadly to include all the villages to the east, north, and south. End quote. I was floored by his speech and the mixed messages he was sending. A selfish bushman? Wasn't that a contradiction in terms? It was clear that the Jews were no pushovers and that I had plenty of work ahead of me. What I soon was to learn that Jew discourse was couched in a rough idiom, often delivered with irony and hard-edged wit. I quickly learned that my relative wealth made me a constant target for gift requests, a constant injunction towards sharing and leveling. On one occasion, an older man had been particularly helpful in an aspect of the research, and after much cajoling, I gave him a shirt. He took the shirt and, without skipping a beat, said, "If you give someone a shirt, you should give them a pair of pants, too." Subsequent research on hunter-gatherers found this device widespread and has been labeled demand sharing. And I was to encounter it on many occasions in the years to come. My first year plus of fieldwork sped along in a whirl of events and new revelations, with frequent epiphanies. Early on, I set out 5 priorities. First, learning Junquasi. I was struggling to learn the language and had to learn a working knowledge of Setswana to get access to Kung speakers. In the pre-computer era, new vocabulary items were entered on 3x5 cards. Traditional knowledge. I wanted to learn everything I could about plants and animals, especially the mongongo tree and nut. I admired my growing card file of named plants, 50 species, 100 species, then 150 species, and I started drying and packing plant presses with specimens for identification. Also, I was determined to see if I could leave behind my store of canned goods and live for a time eating only foods that I had gathered or had been shared. Third, I was determined to count every person in the 9 dispersed waterholes of the Novi area. And I started assigning master numbers from number 1 on to make sure of the accuracy and avoid duplication. Old Kumugwe happened to be number 13, his wife Toka 14, and his lovely daughter-in-law Bao was number 24. I left the field in 1965, having counted up to 466. By the second field trip, the count had doubled to 960. Fourth, having learned the genealogical method at Toronto and Berkeley, I started collecting genealogies among the Jews as soon as I arrived. I wanted to see how everyone was related. Fifth, I was fascinated by the Juntois medicine dance documented by Lord Marshall and by John Marshall in his famous film, Montreal. I attended day and night dances whenever I could and watched as men achieved trance states so deep that they could step into fire without burning their feet. I was also excited to discover that women had a dance cult of their own called the drum dance, Garutsi or Guatsi. Women stood in a circle and clapped and sang while a man or men played the long drum as women healers entered trance states. My first post-fieldwork publication was a piece called Trance Cure of the Kung Bushman, published in Natural History magazine in 1967. In that first year of fieldwork, the overall goal was to learn as much as I could about subsistence, joining women on gathering trips and accompanying the men on long hunts. As a fairly fit 25-year-old, I prided myself that I could keep up with them on hunts that ranged 10 to 15 miles on an average day. But by late afternoon, I was pooped and ready to head back to camp. What staggered me was that when, after logging so many miles, men twice my age would flush an antelope and break into a quarter-mile sprint to chase it down and spear it with the aid of dogs. The Sioux are famous for their hunting stories, and here is my best one. Kumagoy's 3 sons and I, one day, went out to retrieve a kudu that they had shot with poison arrows the day before. They left off tracking the animal to allow the poison to work overnight. Arriving on the site the next morning, where the kudu had died, we found a pride of lions busy on the carcass. Well, I said to my companions, assuming the meat was lost, I guess that's it for today, and I prepared to turn around and go home. Instead, Bao, the husband of Bao, and his brothers started walking in the opposite direction towards the lions. They walked slowly but steadily and addressed the lions in loud, clear voices. "O lions, hear us. You, our kinfolk, listen to us. That is our meat you are eating. Our children are at home, crying with hunger, weak with hunger. Our little babies are depending on us to feed them. They are waiting." This spoken all the while moving steadily forward as I desperately scanned the surroundings for a tree I could climb when the lions turned on us. When they got to within 50 yards, an amazing thing happened. The lions started to move away. One by one, they casually lifted their heads from the kill and trotted off. Gao and his brothers squatted down by the kill and started butchering the meat that remained into 4 loads for carrying back to camp. The next day, as they cooked and feasted on the meat, I asked the brothers, "What was that all about? Couldn't we have gotten ourselves killed? What made you think that the lions would give up so easily?" Their mother, Kokanga, wife of old Tuma, and very wise, answered the question. She said, "You white people, we don't understand your language, but the creatures of the bush, we do understand them, and they understand us. When lions are hunting, we hear them talking to each other, saying, 'Come and eat this food,' and we don't interfere. But when we hunt, we expect them to respect us too. So that is why the boys told them to leave, and they did." This remarkable story stayed in my field notes buried for years until it resurfaced after a nudge from Elizabeth Marshall Thomas. As a young woman, Liz had accompanied her parents and younger brother John to do pioneering research on the Juntoisi in the 1950s. Her book, The Harmless People, is a classic. Then in 1990, Elizabeth wrote a piece in the New Yorker. The title, The Old Way, later a book, referred to her understanding of what the Sioux told her about the old way in which animals and men understood each other and respected their domains. And then she described hunters driving lions off kills in exactly the same terms I had witnessed 25 years before. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I confess I would have greeted Thomas's account with skepticism. Yet what we had both seen opened a profound moment for reflection. Could human hunters in the distant past have coexisted in relative harmony with other predators, as illustrated by these observations? In 1965, I left the field, and soon, with my PhD in hand, I took a teaching job at Harvard, where DeVore and I embarked on two major projects. First, we organized the Man the Hunter Conference at the University of Chicago, which took place in 1966 and resulted in the 1968 book of the same name. The book was successful in launching an era of renewed interest in the anthropology of hunter-gatherers, but also launched a raft of criticism from feminists about the choice of title. The irony was that despite the title, one of the major theses of the book was to emphasize the hitherto underestimated importance of gathered foods and women's work in hunter-gatherer survival, and by extension in human evolution overall. In almost all foragers outside of the Arctic and subarctic, vegetable foods, largely provided by women, form 50 to 80% of the diet. Yet the evidence for this was largely absent from the archaeological record, which consisted primarily of stone and bone. I am forever indebted to Adrian Zillman and the late Nancy Tanner, whose series of articles in the feminist journal Signs in the late 1970s pointed out that, titles aside, my work on the Kung and that of others actually supported the anti-patriarchal pro-woman position. Donna Haraway, in her Primate Visions, confirmed this reading. DeVore's and my second project was to develop an expanded field proposal for NIH that would take us back to the Dobie area with a number of graduate students. With an NIH grant, Irvin, his wife Nancy, and I returned to Dobie in September '67. First to join us was my then wife, Dr. Nancy Howell, a demographer, and then followed by several graduate students from Harvard. There was Patricia Draper, child behavior student of John and B. Whiting. Henry Harpending, a population geneticist. John Yellen, an Old World archaeologist who mapped recent abandoned village sites, and later John's wife, archaeologist Allison Brooks. Late in the decade, our group was joined by Mel Connor, an infant behavior specialist, and his wife, Marjorie Shostak, the late and much missed, who later authored the bestseller, Nisa, the Life and Words of a Kung Woman. The last member of our hardy band in 1970 was Megan Beasley, a folklorist who became a dedicated applied anthropologist and founder of the Kalahari People's Fund. As you all know, each of these students developed into major scholars in their own right, and any one of them could be up here delivering an equally substantial personal history of their own life and times in the Kalahari. In addition to their own accomplishments, our little band trained students and now grand students who have carried on this work. I'm thinking of such figures as Robert Hitchcock, Elizabeth Cashman, Jacqueline Solway, Renee Sylvain, Helga Drever, Matthias Gunther, as well as associates such as Richard Katz, Carol Wortman, Renee Pennington, Polly Wiesner, Jennifer Hayes, and Victoria Goodman. And to think, all of this had its genesis in a cluster of tents and huts at Dobie, Botswana in the 1960s. As a footnote, the next meeting of the Society for African Archaeology will be held in Toronto next June, with a special retrospective session on Kalahari research from the 1960s forward. Participants will include Howell, Draper, Yellen, Brooks, Beasley, and myself, and others. The dates are June 22nd to 24th, 2012. After the joint publication of our research efforts in the book Kalahari Hunter-Gatherers, the members of our fellowship went in a range of different directions. Several, including Beasley, Howell, Draper, Shostak, and myself, maintained the Kung Junkwasi as the core of our research and writing. Others, like Yellen, Brooks, Harpending, and Connor, explored other topical and geographical opportunities. By the 1980s, I had logged 37 months of fieldwork and published a monograph, The Kung San, Men, Women, and Work in a Foraging Society, to good reviews. So I cast about for new challenges. In 1980, I was recruited into a film project with a BBC series titled Over My Objections, Mankind in the Making, on human evolution, hosted by Richard Leakey. The Kung Junkwasi segment can still be found in episode 2 of the 5-part series. Soon after, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation approached me to participate in a film project on environmental crisis entitled Planet for the Taking. So in 1983, my family and I went back to the Kalahari to film in company with the show's host, Canada's iconic champion of the environment, David Suzuki. A third film project unfolded a decade later when I went to the Namibian side of the border to make a film with an unlikely yet wonderful collaborator. As an undergraduate at Harvard, Yo-Yo Ma had taken an anthropology intro course with Irvin DeVore, a brilliant lecturer, and had been intrigued by DeVore's accounts of the San people and their unique way of life. Approached by a British film company to do a documentary, Ma told them that he'd always wanted to go to the Kalahari to meet the Kung. I was recruited to be Yo-Yo's interpreter and guide. We worked together for 3 weeks, and the result was the 1994 film, Distant Echoes, Yo-Yo Ma and the Kalahari Bushmen, a fascinating musical and cultural exchange. On the research front, the 1980s proved to be an active period. After Nancy and I had separated, I had met Harriet Rosenberg in the early 1970s, an historian and anthropologist with a joint degree from the University of Michigan. Harriet had done doctoral fieldwork in France, but was to prove a resourceful and creative collaborator for the rough life of the Kalahari, in spite of the fact there were no Michelin 3-star restaurants within 5,000 miles. Harriet, a York University professor, and I applied for and received a SHIRT grant to study aging and caregiving among the Junkwasi, how the Zhu regarded the universal process of aging and how successful they were in caring for the elderly among them. In June of 1985, we were heading into the Kalahari through Botswana. Harriet and I, our 6-year-old daughter Miriam, and my 14-year-old twin sons with Nancy, Alex, and David, as well as several colleagues. In the dying days of apartheid, it was a very troubled time for the region. Mandela and his associates were still in prison. The streets of South Africa were rocked by demonstrations. The apartheid regime in South Africa was increasingly desperate to hold on to power. Botswana was providing asylum for dissidents from the regime. One night, we witnessed a few yards from our hotel a cross-border incursion by South African special forces that attacked and killed residents of an African National Congress safe house in the capital, Gaborone. It was in this tense atmosphere that tragedy struck us personally. A few days later, driving on a notoriously bad gravel road through the desert, our vehicle struck a sharp rock, blew a tire, and rolled over. Our precious son, Alex, was seriously injured, along with postdoctoral student Melissa Nauer. after medevac to Johannesburg, Alex, 6 days short of his 15th birthday, died in hospital. Melissa died soon after, a double tragedy from which it took us years to recover. We canceled our plans and returned to Toronto. After a crisis of such magnitude, one natural tendency is to abandon one's work and not to return to Africa at all. We struggled for many months and finally decided to go back. The next year, helped by bereavement therapy, Harriet and I and our daughter Miriam returned to Botswana to continue the work. It was interesting that the Zhu were well informed about our loss. Transistor radios were common in the 1980s with broadcasts in Setswana, and our story had been headline news for days the previous June. When we reached Dobie in June of 1986, the Zhu, despite their reputation for toughness and lack of sentimentality, were extremely thoughtful and offered us hugs, words of comfort, shared tears of condolence, and even a church service under the trees in Alex's and Melissa's memory. We embarked on our program of research, and it was here that Harriet began her inquiries into the nature of relations between the old and infirm and their caregivers. Research that resulted in the paper Complaint Discourse and its valuable insight into how kvetching was the key to successful old age, and an insight into Zhu core cultural values. Several other Kalahari researchers, including Nancy Howell, Patricia Draper, and Megan Beasley, have also researched and provided insights into old age among the Zhunkwazi. By the mid-1990s, life had begun to get back to normal, and my work had begun in collaboration with Richard Daly on assembling the manuscript that eventually became the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Hunters and Gatherers. I was again wondering what to do next when I was contacted by Dr. Ida Susser of the City University of New York, a well-known medical anthropologist. Would I be interested, Ida asked, in joining a Columbia University research and capacity building project to help train researchers and service personnel to fight AIDS more effectively? At that point, I knew very little about HIV/AIDS, but I did have 30 years of research and teaching experience in and about Southern Africa. Thus began my career as a medical anthropologist, collaborating with Ida in 5 research trips to Namibia and inaugurating a series of training workshops with our colleague, Dr. Scholastica Apingi at the University of Namibia Faculty of Medical and Health Sciences. In 1999, I started bringing groups of students from the University of Toronto to work as AIDS interns in agencies and clinics. In 2011, we marked the 12th year of the program. My sons David Lee and Luca Rosenberg Lee accompanied us on several of these trips. Namibia and Botswana are 2 of the countries with the highest rates of HIV in the world. And yet, our research on AIDS among the Zhunkwazi has established that their rates, happily, are 75 to 90% lower than the national rates. Women's autonomy and receptivity to condom adoption, including the female condom, are among the keys to their lower infection rates. The Zhunkwazi have undergone dramatic changes in the 5 decades that I've been working with them. The story of Bao might shed some light on the road the Zhunkwazi have traveled since the 1960s. A member of one of the very first families I encountered starting fieldwork, Bao in 1963 was in her mid-20s raising 2 young children. Her fireside was neatly maintained and always open for visitors to share the foods that she had gathered. A conscientious and devoted mother, she had 5 more children in the 60s and 70s. By July 2010, it was over 20 years since I had last seen her. My colleague Megan Beasley also had a very close relationship with Bao. As a young field worker in 1970, Megan had been adopted by the Juntoisi, and it was Bao who gave her her name and put her into the Kuma, or old name, young name relationship. Now that the Botswana-Namibia border was open to vehicles, Megan and I determined to drive from Chumkwe to Dobi and track down some of our oldest friends, including Bao. We knew that her husband Bao had passed away, but we knew very little else about her circumstances. Now in her 70s, what was her living situation? Had her children married and dispersed to other villages? Who had stayed to care for her in her old age? How had the social problems brought by alcohol and the cash economy affected her and her family? When we reached Dobi, we were told that Bao had moved to Mahopa, a nearby waterhole. There was no way for us to give an advance notice of our arrival, so we just showed up. Nothing prepared us for what happened next. With cries of Bao Tsi, Tunta Tsi, Bao is here, Tunta is here, the village emptied, and led by Bao herself, we were greeted with hugs and kisses. Sons and daughters, now fully grown in their 20s and 30s, came out to greet us. Sons-in-law and daughters-in-law were close behind, followed by their children. When the excitement subsided, we sat down with Bao for a conversation. What was remarkable was that it appeared that all her living children, 7 in all, were living with her. Each of them had children of their own, and most were living there as well. The oldest Kuma, now in his 50s, is divorced, but his 2 sons live with him. His 6 younger siblings had 2 to 5 children each, some in their teens and 20s. When a tally was made of the entire village, I counted that Bao had an amazing 28 grandchildren. When other more distant relatives living in the village were counted, the total came to 57, a very healthy sized community. Their economic base was threefold: a continued reliance on gathered food, work for both men and women on government road maintenance projects, and assistance from a nearby mission station. When we learned that there were at least 3 other villages in the Dobi-Mahopa vicinity of comparable size, as well as 2 large villages based on successfully dug boreholes north of Dobi, we came to appreciate that Bao's large and happy family situation was not unique. With the evidence that the HIV rates continued to remain very low, here was living testimony that at least in one sector of Juntois society, life was good. In the 21st century, life for the Juntoisi has changed in many ways. Schools, stores, wage labor, mission churches, and even libraries and cell phone services are now common. Yet much of their original spirit, feisty and funny, remains. I will close with a favorite anecdote that sums up for me some of the intangibles that offer a window to the soul of the Juntoisi and their resilience in the face of change. Twigum was the husband of Marjorie Shostak's Nisa, a strong personality in his own right. He'd have to be to keep up with Nisa. Twi was renowned for his dry wit. On a recent field trip, I was interviewing him and other men about the old days. I asked the group, what did the Jeune Croisy do in the old days? For example, before you got iron pots in trade from the Europeans, what did you cook with? Well, the other men tried to puzzle this out. Tweed, with a perfectly straight face, quipped, well, everyone knows that you cannot survive without iron cooking pots, so we must have died. I admired his snappy comeback, but I also saw a deeper meaning. It reminded me of my experience with the Joux leveling devices so effectively mobilized in the incident I wrote up in the widely reprinted Eating Christmas in the Kalahari. Like the jokers about the Christmas ox, Twee seemed to be saying, get a grip. We got along very well without you, so get over yourself. May that irreverence, despite all that has changed, sustain the Jeune Croisy into the 21st century. Thank you.
We still have a number of minutes left, about 10 or 15 minutes for questions and answers, if people have questions for Dr. Lee.
Any questions? Yes.
I just want to say thank you. That was really wonderful.
Thank you. My son Luca, when he read a draft of this, said, "Dad, you've got to write a book." So, and I'm going to help you. So I'm going to take him up on that offer. Yes.
I've used every edition of the Jeune Croisy
Yes,
my
great.
agricultural anthropology classes, and I'm wondering, is there going to be another edition? Is there any possibility of updating that?
Yes, the 4th edition is in press, and it's supposed to be out in the spring. I believe that my editor, Janice Stockard, is in the room. So Janice has taken over from George and Louise Spindler, taken the series over. So for which we are grateful to keep it going. So 4th edition, coming up. Yes?
The film The Hunters, which I saw when I was an undergraduate, was that done by the Marshalls?
Yes, that was John Marshall's inaugural effort as a filmmaker when he was still in his 20s, early 20s, yeah. And remains a classic, although the dispute continues about how many different giraffe hunts were involved in it, but it was beautifully put together, yeah. And it had a lot of important information apart from the dramatic master narrative. Yes. Yes.
You've really done a wonderful job of dealing with the kind of media that communicate with a variety of people, from professionals to students. You've done film, you've done books, you've done short stories that have been replicated, we all know, widely.
Mm-hmm.
Are you experimenting with new media, the internet, but communicating about the Jeune Croisy in new and different ways? Are you collaborating with folks?
Well, I'll mention 2 things. Megan Beasley founded the Kalahari People's Fund with the collaboration of several of us, Irv and Nancy DeVore and myself, in '73. And the Kalahari People's Fund now has a pretty decent website called the Kalahari People's Network, which is, I think, run from South Africa by colleagues in Cape Town, and posts up-to-date information on land claims and activities, and there's still lots of political stuff going on. So that's one area one could look. And the University of Toronto has put a massive amount of my own material up in a site called T-Space, University of Toronto Library's T-Space, T for Toronto. And there's close to 3,000 photographs that are searchable. There's 39 or 40 of my papers, published papers, that are like open source now. And a lot of Nancy Howell's databases. She just published a new book, Life History of the Dobie Kung, in 2010, and other materials. So there is And that's supposed to be up for, the long term. And and that's being added to periodically. So those are two examples.
You should think of putting your life story on YouTube.
Thanks. Yes. Okay, any other questions or comments? Yes.
My name is Eddie Shaker from Dalhousie University. I have my advisor, Robin Oakley, did PhD in aging under your supervision.
Yeah.
And presently we are using that your classical text that you have seen for my research in relation to Asian economic struggle and cash economy and this thing among tribal populations in South India.
Yes.
Which is very relevant, and I really appreciate that classical text. Like, actually, I was looking for such a like some good and classical and indigenous type of text. But I don't think like we have many classical texts are available in here are Asian. Asian Anthropological associations. But I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. Yes?
Yeah, I was just wondering how much hunting and gathering still goes on amongst the Juntasi and the San people in the area.
That's a great question. For the last 2 years, I've been working with teams, research teams of students. Now I'm working mostly on the Namibian side of the border to assess the question of to what extent does hunting and gathering play a role in subsistence, even in the 21st century. The answer is hunting not much because of restrictive game laws, but there's an enormous amount of gathering going on, and about, I estimate, somewhere between 30 and 40% of the food, even for town dwellers, comes from gathered foods. And so I'm really happy when I went out to survey outer villages that people are going out, digging roots, collecting nuts and berries, and I think that's the difference between destitution and some reasonable state of, if not prosperity, at least sustainability, that they have this component of wild foods too, and they're still using it. Yeah. Yes, Ida, my collaborator.
I just want to say you're very modest. It was a wonderful, wonderful talk. I didn't know half. But I just want to add one thing you didn't mention. Look, when my son was like in 7th grade in New York City schools, they had a primary or 7th grade curriculum in history that had been developed by Richard and others through the AAA.
Yes.
And it was really powerful. They were still using it. Well, this would be the late 90s, I don't know, 20 years later.
Right.
And I think it's something that we might regard as a model today when we're talking a lot about public anthropology. I think probably we could still use it today, but maybe we have to like look at it again. And
Yes.
I really think that that was very important. And then you saw that same kid next to that poster there. So he followed up on that 7th grade class, not today. I mean, he had the A inside.
Yes.
But, I would like maybe to, did you not work on that?
Yes, we did something for the AAA curriculum project. I think it was in the 70s, the early 70s, and produced teaching materials. And every 5 years or so, someone says, "Oh, my kid was using your teaching material in their, grade 7 or grade 11 anthro class." So it was nice to know. Yeah, thanks for that. Yes.
I have a question regarding, they were not allowed to hunt, you said, because of the game laws.
Yes.
Could they go inside the territory to gather?
Well, they were at liberty to gather. So gathering was very widespread and continued wherever the opportunity presented itself. And sometimes you'd be driving in the bush with them and they would knock on the window and say, "Stop, stop." And then you'd stop and the women would fan out and start harvesting berries. And 10 minutes later they'd be back. So they were still very much on top of the gathered food resources.
can I then follow up with the next question? Is there a territory where they are not allowed to go in, like the Kalahari Game Reserve?
Yes. Well, on the Botswana side, there's the giant Central Kalahari Game Reserve where, as long as they're hunting with bows and arrows, they can hunt and, of course, do all the gathering they want. On the Namibia side, there is this point that if you continue to hunt with bow and arrow, you may take selected game. If you're hunting with a rifle, then you have to get a whole rigmarole of red tape to get a license. Interestingly enough, there's an enormous overpopulation of elephants in the Nai area. And the license, in case you're interested, the license to hunt an elephant in the Nai, in the San territory, is only $80,000 US. So, don't rush to the door for that. But the beauty of it is that whenever these licenses are sold to clients, white hunters, the meat comes back to the community. And so that could be several tons of elephant meat during the season which is winter, of elephant meat for just widely distributed. So another major input into the protein. Yes, I saw a hand at the back.
Has anyone ever picked up on the mongongo nut as a commercial enterprise?
Yes. Many years ago, there was a U.S. agricultural station in San Antonio, Texas. And I can't remember if it was something that John Yellen, who was the NSF, or I tried to put together. But it was, they got a sample of them and weren't very happy with the results. They were hard to germinate. But then there was another, perhaps the second most important source of protein is Bauhinia sea bean. And the sea bean, they got a sample of sea beans and were very successful in propagating them in the soil of South Texas. So what's become of it, I don't know. Maybe someone can follow up on that. But the German imperial, Germany controlled Southwest Africa until 1914, and they tried to experiment with what there's like a whole literature in the German colonial archives on experiments with mongongo nuts to try to make them commercially viable, but nothing came of it. Yes, Cheryl.
Richard, did someone get anything from the Hoodia products that have been sold recently?
The Hoodia are found way to the south of them, and there has been a recent major settlement that some of the San and desert dwellers who basically gave the world the Hoodia are getting a cut of the royalties. The San of our area actually have another product, which is the devil's claw, which is an arthritis remedy, Harpagophytum, and they're harvesting it like crazy, and there's big bags of it being harvested, and they get paid for that. And I'm pretty sure you can go into your health food store and get devil's claw for treatment of arthritis. Any other questions? Yes?
I'm still wondering, but I'm in the same situation with indigenous population in Sri Lanka.
Yes.
And
Dr. Stegerborg, by the way.
So I'm looking at who is who. Now, if Yokwansi, or however you pronounce it, is allowed to hunt, how much of indigenousness can be within, does he have to be 100%, and how do you go in technology to prove that? Or if he's half indigenous and half, let's say, or whatever, or how much of indigenous blood does he have? And can he go hunt with friends that are not indigenous?
That's a good question. It's a double or triple barreled question, so I'm not sure exactly how to tackle it in 30 seconds. But let's put it this way. If you hunt with bow and arrow, you are allowed to hunt. And not that many people take up the offer, shall we say. And but I think in the outer villages, which I can rarely get to, it's more common. And so, but whether someone who's not is just not, it's beyond my knowledge at this point. But it's something to look into.
I'd like to thank you all for attending and thank Dr. Lee for his wonderful distinguished lecture. And we'll be adjourning now. Dr. Lee may be here outside the room for a few minutes to talk if you have additional questions. If you'd like to meet any of the prize winners, they'll probably be around for a few minutes too if you want to talk with them. If not, I'd like to thank you all for coming and remember to see you next year. Thank you very much.